She built the company brick by bloody brick, but they tossed her aside like trash on payday. 2 weeks later, she walked back through those doors holding the secret that could burn it all to ash. A forged friendship. A hidden fortune. And a man long thought dead, standing in her way. You won't believe who betrayed her, or what she found hidden inside the photo that changed everything. Don't read this unless you're ready to tear down everything you believe about loyalty, power, and the lies we inherit as legacy. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. It all began on a Monday, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and felt like a curtain call for something no one had rehearsed. Claire Weston had seen enough boardrooms to know when the air shifted. The kind of shift that tells you a storm's been scheduled behind your back. Brent Harlow swaggered in like he owned the oxygen in the room. Fresh from business school, dressed in a suit that cost less than it claimed, he grinned like a man who thought power came from titles. "You're being terminated," he said, like he was offering her a mint. "No review. No thanks. Just a pink slip and a smirk." Claire didn't flinch. Didn't scream. Just reached for her box and placed her father's photo on top, the one of them smiling on the day her first office opened. She didn't even say goodbye. The silence left behind said more than words could. That's when they thought she was finished. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that 2 weeks earlier, Douglas Whitmore, the family lawyer with a handshake older than some countries, had delivered her a manila envelope. Inside it, the truth her father had buried like treasure. She owned it all. 90% of Weston and Hale. Full control. Voting rights. The shares triggered on her 30th birthday, and yesterday, she turned 30. Her father had trusted her to fight through fire before handing her the sword. So she planned the meeting. The real one. Not the one with board presentations and catered croissants. No, this was the kind with legal documents, security guards, and truths that turned men pale. When she walked back into that boardroom, Brent was laughing. He didn't stop until she put her hand on the table and slid the documents forward like a royal flush at a crooked poker game. "I am the majority shareholder," she said. "You no longer have authority here." It wasn't the sentence that stunned them. It was Franklin Burke, the ancient board member who'd stayed silent through scandal and silence, who stood up, leaned on his cane, and said, "She's telling the truth." Brent's face turned the color of sour milk. His mouth moved, but the words had run off scared. Claire didn't wait. She motioned for a vote on his dismissal. 7 hands rose. 1 abstained. 2 trembled. Just like that, he was history. But Claire didn't take the CEO office. She walked right past it. She drove to Maple and Bean Cafe, the little corner shop where her dad used to take her every Friday. Where he told her, companies don't have souls unless you give them one. She remembered. So she began there. In the coming weeks, whispers filled the halls. Claire didn't bark orders. She whispered change. She found Tina Morales in customer service, quiet, brilliant, forgotten. Promoted her. She tracked down Derek Fields, the developer who'd quit when Brent stole credit for his patent work. Rehired him. Gave him his own team. She brought Margaret Quinn into HR and gave her a mandate: cut the rot. Toxic managers. Abusers in sheep's clothing. Gone. And then, people first. It wasn't new. It had been buried in the old files, her father's dream. A plan to reward real effort, real creativity. Claire brought it to life. Made it gospel. Some cheered. Some left. Some hid. And one watched. Someone close. Someone smiling. Someone dangerous. The morning it happened, Claire was alone in her office, reading a letter that had no stamp. Just her name. A warning. I know what you did. He's not dead. That's when the past exploded. Her father, Richard Weston, the man who built an empire and died in a private plane crash, might not have died at all. She dropped the letter. Outside her window, Riverview kept humming like nothing had changed. But Claire knew better. This wasn't the end of the beginning. It was the beginning of the reckoning. There was something about the handwriting that didn't feel like a threat, it felt like a whisper from the grave, honest and aching. Claire stared at the words over and over until the black ink started to smear from her trembling fingertips. He's not dead, it read, and it wasn't written with menace, but with the sorrow of someone who'd watched too much truth rot behind locked doors. Her father, Richard Weston, had been presumed dead after his private jet disappeared over Lake Superior 5 years ago, no wreckage, no body, only headlines and an empty casket. The company mourned, the town grieved, and Claire wore black for a man who'd never left a goodbye. Now someone was telling her the goodbye was a lie. She didn't call the board. She didn't call the police. Instead, she drove to the one place she thought might still hold his breath, the lakeside cabin he built with his own hands during the recession of '94. It had been locked since the funeral, untouched by weather, memory, or betrayal. As she stood on the porch, key in hand, the air changed, colder, not from wind, but from knowing the past was watching. She stepped inside to find dust, silence, and something stranger than either, a pair of muddy boots by the fireplace. Not old mud. Not 5-year mud. Fresh. She was not alone. Claire didn't call out. She had learned long ago that the loudest voice is often the least prepared. She walked slowly into the den, where a photograph sat face down on the mantel. When she flipped it over, her knees buckled. It was her father. Not in a boardroom. Not at the beach. But seated in that very cabin, dated 2 weeks ago. Before she could process it, the door creaked behind her. "Claire," said the voice she hadn't heard since she was 25 and dressed in black. "You shouldn't have come." She turned, expecting a ghost, finding a man half-shadowed, gaunt, aged far more than 5 years should allow. He looked like Richard Weston, but older in pain than in time. "Dad?" Her voice cracked, and in that crack lived every sleepless night, every fatherless decision, every lie fed to her like medicine. He nodded once, and something in his face crumbled. "You were supposed to wait," he said, his voice barely more than wind. "I didn't want this." Claire stared at him, anger rising like heat. "You didn't want what?" "To tell your daughter you faked your death and let her bury an empty coffin while the vultures picked at your company?" "I didn't fake anything," he said, sitting down like the weight of years had finally broken his back. "I was betrayed." The word echoed in the wooden walls like a curse. He told her the story slowly, like he was peeling off layers of a wound he'd been hiding. His plane never crashed. The explosion was staged. And it wasn't just business enemies, it was someone close. Someone inside. A partner. A friend. A brother in arms. The name he spoke next made Claire's heart stop cold. Franklin Burke. The same Franklin Burke who'd stood beside her in the boardroom. The same man who confirmed her majority ownership with that slow nod of honor. The same man who, it turned out, had orchestrated the disappearance of Richard Weston and taken his place as silent puppet master behind the scenes. It made no sense. Franklin had mentored her, protected her, even smiled when she stood tall in that meeting room. Claire wanted to scream, to deny it, but her father had proof, records, letters, even a photo with a timestamp showing Franklin at the airstrip the morning of the staged crash. "I wanted to stay dead," Richard said, leaning forward like a man asking forgiveness. "Until I knew you were safe. Until I saw you had become more than my heir. You became a fighter." Claire couldn't cry. The tears had dried in her somewhere between the lie and the lake. "You have to come back," she said. "They need to see you." "I can't," he whispered, eyes dark. "Franklin isn't just the enemy. He's working with someone else. Someone inside your circle. Someone you trust. A second betrayer. A second knife in her back. And this time, it might be someone she loved. Back at headquarters, the world hadn't changed, but Claire had. She moved differently now, eyes sharper, voice lower, presence heavier. In one hand, she held a photo of her supposedly dead father alive and furious. In the other, a memo from Franklin about expanding executive powers behind her back. But before she could act, the phone rang. Private number. Female voice. If you want to know who else is lying, the woman said, check your father's will. Not the public one. The real one. It's hidden where he left his heart behind. Then she hung up. Claire didn't sleep that night. She drove to the archives at Weston and Hale's original building, a brick structure her father refused to demolish, calling it the bones of the business. Deep in the foundation vault, beneath blueprints and tax records, she found it, a sealed envelope marked, private, to be opened by Claire only. Inside was a second will. One name stood out. A name that didn't belong. Brent Harlow. Her father had listed him as a backup beneficiary, a man he once mentored as a favor to Franklin Burke. A man who would receive controlling interest in case Claire ever refused the company. And in the margin, scrawled in ink, were the words. Franklin insisted. I don't trust him. If this gets to Claire, it's already too late. Claire's breath froze. This wasn't just about power. This was a chess game. And someone had just moved their queen. Claire Weston had never liked the feeling of shadows moving behind her back, she preferred clean fights and open arenas. But what she found in that sealed envelope had undone the ground beneath her, like stepping off a curb and finding an abyss instead of asphalt. Brent Harlow, the smug man she'd fired, the man who walked like power owed him favors, had been tied to her father not just by mentorship, but by legacy. Her father had once seen something in him, or rather, Franklin Burke had whispered enough into Richard's tired ears to make him draft Brent into the family fortune. And now, everything made a sick kind of sense. She thought the betrayal ended at lies and missing planes, but she was wrong. It went deeper. Darker. The next morning, Claire called in Derek Fields, the only developer brave enough to slam a door in Brent's face when he resigned 3 years back. Derek had seen something then, something that had made him flee with only his code and his silence. Brent didn't just take credit, Derek said, eyes flickering toward the locked office door. He was moving data, quietly, surgically, deleting old payroll records, rewriting server logs. I reported it to compliance, but they said it was authorized. By Franklin. Claire felt her stomach turn into stone. The plot wasn't improvised, it was engineered. And now, it was her move. But before she could act, chaos found her first. The receptionist called her from the lobby with a voice that sounded like a child waking from a nightmare. Claire, there's a man here. Says he worked for your father. Says he's dying. She rushed down. There, collapsed in one of the lobby chairs, was Marcus Hale, the co-founder's son. He had vanished without a trace the same month her father's plane went down. For 5 years, no one had heard from him. No calls. No sightings. No obituary. Now, he was back, and bleeding. They carried him into Claire's office, a trail of blood staining the carpet like a path back to the truth. Paramedics were already on the way, but Marcus didn't wait for them. They tried to finish me, he whispered, clutching her sleeve like it was a lifeline. It was never an accident, Claire. Your father knew. Franklin made the deal. But he wasn't the only one. Claire leaned in, heart racing. Who else? She asked, her voice steady though her soul shook. Marcus tried to speak, but coughed instead, a thick, wet sound that brought red to his lips. Then, finally, 2 words escaped him. Daniel Brooks. Claire froze. Daniel, the board's new strategic advisor. The man who toasted her leadership 6 weeks ago. The one who sent cupcakes to interns and flowers to secretaries. The one who asked her, with warmth in his voice and admiration in his eyes, to say a few words at that board meeting. He was the second traitor. Marcus passed out just as the sirens approached. But the damage was done. Claire didn't cry. She didn't scream. She walked back into her office, poured herself a glass of cold water, and stared out the window at a city built on polite deceit. Daniel Brooks had been in every room since her return, smiling, helpful, trustworthy. He was Franklin's perfect inside man. And the worst part? He was the one she trusted most. So she played her hand close. She invited Daniel for lunch, choosing a quiet restaurant where the noise was drowned in jazz and wine glasses. He smiled when he saw her, like nothing had changed. "How's leadership treating you?" he asked, cutting into his steak like it owed him gratitude. Claire smiled. "I need your help with a vote next quarter. Thinking of merging people first into our formal HR operations. More transparency. Fewer shadows." Daniel nodded, the way traders do when they think you're blind. "Smart move," he said. "I'll back it." She sipped her water and imagined his neck snapping under the weight of his own arrogance. When she returned to the office, she locked the door, opened her father's second will again, and noticed something she had missed. A line at the bottom, nearly faded. "One last vault. Access code 0713. Only if the day ever comes when Franklin wins." It wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, Claire drove to the company's off-site data center, where legacy servers, prototypes, and old secrets were buried beneath stone and silence. The vault was real. Hidden behind a panel of retired servers and sealed with an alphanumeric keypad. She entered the code. July 13th, her birthday. Inside the vault, she found blueprints, recordings, and a flash drive labeled, Project Ember. She inserted the drive into a secure terminal and watched. Her father's voice crackled through the static. "If you're hearing this, it means Franklin Burke has turned this company into his playground, and you're the only one left who can stop him. He's not in this alone." Daniel Brooks was paid off by a foreign investor looking to strip the company and flip it for parts. And Brent Harlow. Brent was their pawn. He never had the brains to plan it, just agreed to say yes. Claire watched her father's eyes, so tired, so resolute, as he continued. "There's a shell company in Zurich. Red Haven Holdings. That's where they're laundering the cash. Follow the money, Claire. That's where your war begins." The screen flickered off. Claire didn't move. She sat in silence, surrounded by the last breath of her father's truth, and prepared herself for the fire. But just when she thought she had the full map, fate pulled the rug. A call came through. Unknown number. Same voice as before. Only this time, the woman on the other end didn't whisper. She screamed. "Claire, they're coming. It's not Daniel. It's not Franklin. The real power is still in the shadows. They're watching everything. Get out now." Then static. Then silence. Claire looked up, and realized her office door was ajar. She hadn't left it that way. The sound of the door creaking open wasn't loud, but it cracked through Claire's mind like thunder in a church. She turned slowly, instinct thrumming in her bones, eyes scanning the shadowed threshold where something unseen had trespassed. The air had shifted again, that awful pressure before the storm, the kind her father used to say meant you were already too late. She moved without panic, deliberate, quiet, toward the heavy bookshelf built into the office wall, sliding out the hidden revolver her father had kept for last resort moments. He never thought she'd need it. And yet here she was, staring at the sliver of space between her and a threat that had clearly found its way inside. There was no one. Nothing. Only the low, buzzing hum of the air vents and the soft tick of the antique clock her father had once said would outlive them all. Then she saw it. Written across her glass desk in faint condensation, as though breathed by something long dead and still watching. Don't trust her. Claire's mouth dried. Her reflection in the glass seemed unfamiliar, older, colder, like the cost of truth was starting to show in her bones. The message wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It wasn't about the her in the sentence, it was about Claire realizing someone close, someone trusted, was a knife she hadn't yet seen coming. Her mind spun. Franklin was already exposed. Daniel was already damned. Brent was a memory. Then who was she? And that's when Claire remembered the voice, the one from the phone calls. The woman who had whispered warnings and screamed about shadows. That voice hadn't come from an enemy. It had come from someone with guilt in her chest and blood on her hands. She ran a trace on the last call. Used a backdoor her father built into the telecom system during a labor strike in '96. Within minutes, she had a location ping, an apartment on the edge of town, near the old shipyard. She didn't call for backup. She didn't bring security. She brought a gun. The building was empty. Not abandoned, just lifeless. She moved through the narrow stairwell, light flickering overhead like a stuttering heartbeat. Every creak, every groan of the wood beneath her feet felt like the building remembering secrets it was sworn to bury. Apartment 3C stood with the door ajar, swinging softly like someone had just left, or just arrived. Inside, she found a shrine. Photos of her father, all candid. Newspaper clippings about the crash. One of Claire herself, standing in front of the board after Brent's removal. Pins, strings, markings like the room had been used not for worship, but for war. And then, on the floor, a laptop blinking with a paused video. She pressed play. And the past came alive. Her father appeared, not in a suit, not delivering a speech, but in a soft sweater, holding her as a child. She was maybe 6, 7 years old, sitting on his lap as he recorded her laughing, telling him what she wanted to be when she grew up. You'll run the company someday, he whispered to her in the recording. But don't let anyone take your soul. That's the real asset. Claire didn't cry. But her knees did buckle. Because she recognized the woman holding the camera. Margaret Quinn. The head of human resources. The woman who'd supported her from the first day she walked back into Weston and Hale. The one who said she had always believed in Claire's vision. The same woman who fired a dozen mid-level tyrants without question. The same woman who had access to every file. Every secret. Claire felt the weight of every moment Margaret had stood beside her, every silent nod, every agreement, every word of comfort. Margaret was the ghost in the mirror. She had known about Richard. She had known about Franklin. And worse, she had been playing both sides all along. Claire raced back to headquarters, heart pounding in sync with her boots across polished tile floors. She didn't wait for security clearance. She stormed into HR, found Margaret's office empty, her computer gone, her nameplate stripped clean like it had never existed. But something remained. A handwritten letter, folded neatly on her desk beneath a Weston and Hale branded notepad. It read, I loved your father. He loved me once. But he chose legacy over truth. I tried to protect you. I really did. But they came for me too. And I had to survive. By any means. There was no signature. No apology. Only a key taped to the back, an old brass key labeled R. Weston, safe. Claire knew the safe. It had been her father's personal archive, hidden behind a false wall in the Maple and Bean Cafe, the very place Claire had returned to when she reclaimed the company's soul. She arrived at midnight. The cafe owner, an old friend of her father's, let her in without question. Place hasn't changed, he said, handing her a flashlight and a trembling hand. Still smells like hope. She found the safe buried behind the counter wall, concealed by old ledgers and decoy boxes of baking supplies. The key slid in like it had never been away. The safe opened. Inside were three things. A leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges. A flash drive labeled Contingency Delta. And a photograph. Of her father. And Margaret. Together. Smiling. Holding Claire at age 3. Claire didn't move. Didn't breathe. She opened the notebook and found journal entries from her father, full of regrets, confessions, and finally, a chilling note. If you ever find this, Claire, know this, Margaret was my first love. She was the only one who knew everything. If I disappear, it's either because I failed to save her, or because she failed to save me. Claire closed the notebook and felt something she hadn't in years, grief. Not for a man who vanished. But for a truth that no longer had any clean corners. Back at headquarters, Daniel Brooks had already begun consolidating power, using board technicalities and offshore support. Brent had vanished. Franklin had gone quiet. And Claire was running out of time, leverage, and allies. Until the final message appeared. Printed on her desk, no return address. You're not the heir. You're the decoy. It was the word decoy that dug into Claire's skin like a fishhook, too sharp to ignore, too deep to pull free. She stood in her office surrounded by glass, steel, and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but heavy, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Everything she had believed, every battle she had fought, every step she had taken from the day Brent fired her, suddenly teetered on the edge of fiction. The flash drive she recovered from her father's safe, marked Contingency Delta, had been locked behind layers of encryption only someone in the Weston bloodline could decode. Claire knew this because when she inserted the drive, it didn't ask for a password, it scanned her fingerprint, and it opened. What played next was not a plan. It was a revelation. Richard Weston appeared again, older than the last recording, sitting in the same cabin, but this time with a weariness that didn't come from age, but from betrayal. If you're watching this, he began, then the final curtain has been pulled, and I'm either dead, or wish I was. Claire, if the others have succeeded, you need to know the truth. You are not my daughter. Claire froze. Her blood turned to ice. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't stop watching. We took you in when you were just a baby. You were the daughter of my brother, Jonathan. A man who made mistakes I could never forgive, but I couldn't leave his child behind. Your mother died in childbirth. No one ever came looking for you. We raised you as our own. We loved you. I loved you. I still do. Claire felt the room spin, the walls stretch, the carpet fall out from under her like a magician's trick gone wrong. Everything had been a lie, her name, her legacy, her right to lead Weston and Hale. She had never been the heir. She had been the smokescreen. The drive continued, and her father's voice grew softer, as if the tape itself grieved what it had to reveal. Margaret knew. She was the one who brought you to us. She helped raise you. But she also knew that if the company ever fell into the wrong hands, we might need a distraction. That's what you were, Claire. A brilliant, beautiful distraction. I hated the plan, but it worked. Claire could barely breathe. It wasn't the betrayal that shattered her, it was the realization that every success, every speech, every brave moment in the boardroom had been forged under a false name. She was a Weston by love, but not by blood. The real heir had never been her. So who was? The answer came faster than she expected. Because that afternoon, while Claire sat in the Maple and Bean Cafe with the notebook of her fake father in her lap, the door opened and a man walked in who had been presumed dead for longer than Richard Weston. Jonathan Weston. Her real father. Older, gaunter, wearing a coat that had seen too many winters, with eyes like a man who'd spent a decade carrying the weight of a name no one wanted him to speak. The cafe owner nearly dropped a tray. Claire didn't move. Jonathan walked over slowly, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat without a word. "I saw the footage," Claire said, her voice not angry, but hollow. Jonathan nodded, like he'd been expecting this moment since the day he gave her up. "I didn't come back for the company," he said, voice cracked like an old vinyl record. "I came back because I heard they'd come for you. And I couldn't let my sins become your coffin." Claire didn't know whether to hate him or hug him. So she did neither. Instead, she whispered, "Then who is the real heir?" Jonathan looked away, toward the cafe counter, where a teenage intern was helping an elderly man find the last chocolate cupcake. "There is no heir," he said. "Not anymore. Richard destroyed the documents when you were 12. Legally, you're the only one left." "But he said I was a decoy," Claire pressed, the notebook trembling in her hands. "He said that," Jonathan nodded, "because he didn't think you'd want it. He wanted to protect you from the war. But you didn't run. You walked into the fire." Back at Weston and Hale, Daniel Brooks was rallying the board, using international partners and corporate fear to push through a full structural overhaul. The company would be broken into pieces, sold off to Redhaven Holdings. Thousands would lose their jobs. The name, Weston, would vanish from every building within a month. Claire walked into the boardroom that evening not as a CEO, not as a shareholder, but as something more powerful. As the truth. She brought the footage. The DNA records. The sealed journal. And finally, Jonathan himself. He stood silently as Claire told the board who she really was, where she really came from, and how a dead man had tried to turn a company into a crypt. Then she turned to Daniel. "You said I wasn't the heir," she said. "That I was just a placeholder. A figurehead. But it turns out, all your plans were built on a lie. And I'm the only one left with the power to end them." She motioned to the projection screen. A new document loaded, Transfer of Assets, Weston and Hale Holdings. Signed and dated by Richard Weston, 3 weeks before his death. Not to Franklin. Not to Brent. Not to Redhaven. To Claire Elise Weston. DNA aside. He had chosen her. Daniel didn't speak. Didn't argue. He walked out of the room with the cold dignity of a man who realized the chessboard had flipped, and the queen he thought was fake had just claimed checkmate. Franklin was found a week later, living in Belize under a false identity. Brent was already bankrupt, last seen begging for consulting gigs in Austin. Margaret Quinn disappeared. No trace. Only rumors. And Claire. She didn't stay CEO. She passed the title to Tina Morales, now the youngest female executive in the company's history. Claire returned to Maple and Bean Cafe, hung up the photo of her and Richard, her uncle, her father, her ghost, and started a foundation for ethical leadership training. The interns called her Miss Weston. The board called her Ma'am. But the people? They called her something better. They called her the soul of the company. And one autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves swirled in Riverview's gentle wind, a man stood across the street from the cafe, watching quietly. He had a limp. A scar. And eyes the color of Claire's. Jonathan Weston didn't go inside. He just smiled. And for the first time in decades, he walked away from something not out of shame, but peace. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.